Hello there, and welcome to this Rugby League World Cup final thoughts and review video. I'm your host, Super Saiyan Blue Lucario, so grab a cup of tea and join me to dive into all the final rounds of action in the World Cup and my thoughts on the tournament as a whole. Firstly, we're going to talk about the individual finals. There were 3 at the weekend, and starting with the wheelchair Rugby League World Cup final, England against France. Going into this, England had lost to France in the last 2 World Cup finals, one by 2 points in 2013 and once by 4 points in 2017. This had all the hallmarks of being a very close game, and from the result, it was just that. 28-24, a try, 2 minutes to go, winning it all for England. And it was every bit of nip and tuck, and back and forth action that you want in a final. It set a brand new world record for a wheelchair Rugby League International with over 4,000 people in attendance, which is phenomenal to see. And the game lived up to the hype. It showed that it was going to be a tense one early on, as France took a penalty very early doors and opted to kick at goal for that one. And the back and forth action, France getting the first try on the board through Al-Azhar, England responding, and just going back and forth. It was 14-12 to France at the break, although England can find themselves very hard done by not to actually be in front at halftime. I'm not as familiar with all the wheelchair rules, but I looked things up afterwards, and there was a very harsh call against England. Jack Brown reaching as he fell forward out of his chair, and in the same motion, grounded the ball over the line, but was adjudged to have knocked off. It was adjudged as a double movement. And there was a bit of a theme of that. Really some very borderline calls during the game. But the positive that I saw from England was they didn't spend their time focusing on decisions going against them. They got on with the job. It was a case of, right, that's happened, move on, next job. To try and make sure that the result wasn't down to a decision, it was down to their ability and their performance. And that's what just kept them going. As more riled up as the crowd became. And more like tense that the crowd got because of just how close the game was. France, again, in the second half, it was, again, back and forth. England taking the lead early, France taking it back. England taking the lead, France taking it back. And then both sides trading penalty goals to the point where it was all square with 5 minutes to go before Halliwell's late surge to the line bursting through, and after a lot of deliberation, the try being given, England claiming a 28-24 win. The atmosphere was phenomenal during this game. It was very high pace, virtually non-stop action. Everything that the wheelchair rugby league that could be. Like, that is how the game is currently played at the top level. It is relentless pace, very high skill on show from both teams. France were fantastic in that game. England were great in that game as well. And they gave us the final that this World Cup deserved in front of a great crowd. There's one negative, really, from that final, and that was the antics of a French official on the sideline as a touch judge. Not necessarily down to specifics, but he was really not happy with the fact that England won. And some of the potential calls may have reflected that. I'm not accusing bias or getting in the way or anything like that. There's a lot of people not happy with the officiating, and this is something that rugby league needs to grow to a point where we can avoid situations like this. Neutral referees are a must in international. So we'll go into that on my final thoughts, but the fact that there weren't neutral officials in any of the finals is a part of a wider problem, I think, with the game. And we ended up, like, despite the fantastic skill on show and the brilliant game we just watched, one of the overriding comments about the game was about the official. And that's not what you want. Not in a World Cup final. Not in any game, really. The sign of a good ref and a sign of a good ref in a match is where you don't notice them there. because the game just goes. And it's all about what's on offer. And that's what you want to see. Two teams who gave absolutely everything on the field, delivered a very high skill, high quality game, and people are talking about the officiating. Plus a little bit of a dampener on it, but England did win the Wheelchair World Cup, succeeding alongside the Physical Disability Rugby League victory for England, where the men's and women's unfortunately fell short in the semi-finals, respectively. Speaking of the other World Cups, we have the Women's World Cup final, Australia against New Zealand. After the group stage game, I thought this would be quite a close one. However, when Australia are in a mood in rugby league, be it men's or women's, they are unstoppable. They are unplayable. They are untouchable. And my God almighty, was it a privilege to watch women's rugby league at such high quality. They were relentless from minute one. New Zealand couldn't live with the speed of the game at all. They tried. There were some big hits flying in from the Ferns to try and wrestle any momentum, but they couldn't gain ground forward. Their forwards were shut down. They're big strike players. They were getting 3-4 in the tackle every time, and then the defense instantly resetting. The defensive shape was much better organized from the Gillaroos than the Ferns could. And Australia, they just maintained that pace and intensity. It was a taste of professionalism and class, and the skills on show from the likes of Taryn Aiken, Emma Tonagato, Jess Surgis, like, they all clicked. And it made you realize just how much an off day they had in the group stage. I mean, there was a lot of mistakes in that game in the group stage, and they weren't hitting the heights that they are capable of. But on a dry pitch, no wet weather, nothing like that to be blamed, just a cold day. They turned on the style and performed absolutely incredibly. And their professionalism and aspirations for perfection were personified in the post-match interview from the player of the match, saying how disappointed they were to concede a point. As New Zealand did manage to get a late try. It was a very well-worked try as well. They deserved a score for their efforts during the game. They played as well as they could, but they could not stop the juggernaut that is Australia at all. And a few in the crowd were thinking, oh, England might have given a better game. England struggled with the pace of New Zealand in the semi-finals. Australia were a step above that. So I'm actually grateful that England didn't get there, because that could have set back English Women's Rugby League a few leagues, a few steps even, had they suffered something like that in the final. So I'm glad they didn't on that. So it sort of saves face. But it also highlights what must be done for the women's game going forward. We'll talk about that later as well. But the actual final itself, it was just relentless from Australia. And as insane as it sounds, they conceded 12 points in the entire tournament in the women's game. They had 3 clean sheets, which in rugby league is not normal. That shows how relentless their defense was, and just how skillful they were in attack as well. If you don't already watch the NRLW, I encourage you to do so from next season, because there are some phenomenally talented athletes in that Australian team. Not to say there weren't in New Zealand as well, but they just couldn't get going at all. Which now leaves us with the men's final, Australia and Samoa. Samoa making their first World Cup final in their history, the first new side in 34 years to make a Rugby League World Cup final. Hopefully signs of better things still to come. I'll be honest, I expected Australia to wipe the floor with them. Yet Samoa competed much better than expected. Again, we're going to have to talk about officiating. However, in this case, it's not the neutrality of the ref that's in question. Because there were 2 big turning points in this game, I think. 2 moments where the officials come into question. One of which is nothing to do with the Australian referee, and entirely down to the English touch judge, who failed to make the call. This is where the quality of officiating has to improve. So Samoa, because it was very even contest the first 15 minutes, and Samoa had a kick from deep in their own half, which was a 40-20 from within 40 of their own line, and it went out within 20 of the Australian line, despite the best efforts of James Tedesco, who desperately tried to keep the ball back inside. Ball very clearly hit the touchline. You can see it on TV, you can see it plain as day. Why the video ref couldn't interfere and say, overall, as hang on, no, that ball's gone. That's a 40-20. How the touch judge who was there, who should have seen it, the touch judge should have seen it. And who knows what could have happened off the back of it. Whether Samoa would have cracked the Australian defence, I don't know. Australia were very, very well organised in defence, and we're on top. The second half had another key moment in it, and that was where a yellow card was given. A lot of people are calling for a red card in this situation and saying perhaps the referee bottled it here. I can see points on both sides of the fence there. Because the guy's clearly, he's gone in to lead with the forearm. I just pushed the guy away, and he's connected with the elbow to the head. There's no malicious intent. He's trying to push him away, push him off, fend him off, and he's caught him badly. He's knocked him clean out cold. For the contact of their head, in a league game, that's an immediate red card, regardless of intent. There's more leniency in internationals. The yellow card, in this case, I think a yellow card was the right call, which is what was given in the end. But I can also understand on the other perspective that it could have been red. And had it been red, that could have really changed the outlook of the game. However, those two moments are not, for me, what decided the men's final. What decided the men's final were the switch-offs in defence from Samoa. In a game against Australia, if you used to have any hope of winning, you have to be fully switched on from minute 1 to minute 80 because they don't stop. They don't slow down. They do not stop coming at you. And there were too many moments, for example, when Stephen Crichton, huge hit, shut down one of the Australian players, absolutely leathered him. And Samoa are so G'd up by this, they forget Australia, then get up, play the ball, run down the blind side, and power through a weak tackle and score. Because that is what Australia do. They get on with the job at hand and just continue. It says, okay, you smash one, we keep going. We keep going again. We will keep going. And it's that relentless juggernaut that was brought on by Samoa's naivety and inexperience within this level of game. The entire crowd was behind Samoa. The entire crowd was willing them on. And they did have their moments. There were too many soft defense moments where they switched off and Australia burst through. They went through Anthony Milford a couple of times. He's not well known for his defense. And Australia targeted him. And they made them pay off the back of it. There needed to be more backup for Milford in those situations. He needed more support from his teammates who would have known that he's probably not going to be able to make those one-on-one tackles in the situation that the big, powerful Australian forwards were coming at him, and the volume of carries that they were making directly at Milford, it shut him out of the game. He was so focused on trying to defend that he couldn't have much of an impact with the attack in possession. Samoa did get 2 tries, one off a Crichton intercept, much like he did in the semi-final against England. And there was also another score in the corner as well. So Samoa did play their part in the final. It was a brilliant atmosphere. And Samoa really did announce themselves on the world stage as a major force, a major power here. As long as they can keep the current crop of players together and continue the players being able to play via heritage, they will continue that development. But Australia, again, too good, and have now won 75% of all Rugby League World Cups with their 12th success in the competition. Australia women's now have 3 in a row matching New Zealand Ferns of the 6 World Cups taking place there, while England have now won 2 out of 4 wheelchair World Cups, France having 2 successes as well. denying the three-peat. So now we have some final thoughts on the competitions as a whole. We'll go through the good and the bad here because we can't have rose-tinted glasses on it. We have to look at it objectively. Firstly, let's look at the wheelchair tournament. World record crowds every game involving England. From game 1 onwards. The interest in wheelchair rugby league has never been so high. There are new teams cropping up off the back of this World Cup. A legacy of this World Cup is getting more participation in the wheelchair game. Obviously, the Wheelchair Super League has been going on for the past couple of seasons and is only going to improve the strength of the game. The question we'll have now is how do we take it to the next level? How do we get it to the kind of professionalism that we can see in the men's game? And how do we capitalize on this boom of interest? One possible way, I think, is having the Wheelchair Super League with a game on free-to-air TV every week when their season is on. And it doesn't necessarily have to be at the same time as the able-bodied season. Let's capitalize on the interest. Let's maximize the audience. Let's have those games on. And we need that free-to-air. That free-to-air needs to be a consistent thing across the board. Channel 4's coverage of Super League this year was brilliant. We have Premier Sports as well with the championship. It needs more exposure, more eyes on the game. And the same has to be said in the wheelchair game. Otherwise, the interest could fade away again. It's a great sport. It's a very inclusive sport. And the opportunity is there to really develop sport. And it could be at the forefront of developing rugby league worldwide alongside the women's game. Because the gap between the top sides and the bottom sides in terms of who qualified for the World Cup, that can be closed quickly because it's not necessarily that full-time professional right now. With more access to coaching, more access to time in the field, that gap can be closed. The same can be said about the women's game as well. The gap between most of these good teams and the sides who barely qualified, that can be closed in 5 to 10 years with the right investment. To do the same in the men's game would take tens of millions and probably a few decades. And again, we'll go into that shortly. We're talking about the wheelchair game right now. I'm just getting a bit sidetracked a little. So the crowds were a huge positive for the wheelchair game. Then we look at the teams involved. England and France, by far and away, were the best sides there. There's no question about that. Australia, considering they haven't had meaningful opposition for a few years, performed much better than expected. And with the advent of State of Origin for the wheelchair game, and they're developing their domestic competition, they will probably catch England and France in the next few years. And I think there'll be at this rate of growth, there could be 3 genuine contenders in the wheelchair tournament in 2025. As far as the other sides, obviously Wales made the semi-finals, but didn't stand a chance. Ireland didn't compete as well as I would have hoped. Spain had some moments, and you could tell the quality was in there off the back of some of their players playing for Catalan. There needs to be more growth and within Spain itself. And the news coming out of Spain is basically wheelchair rugby is spearheading the development of rugby league as a whole over there. Because their wheelchair team is much more successful. And hopefully, off the back of interest within the wheelchair team, the able-bodied could generate interest as well, which is only going to be good for the game in Spain. But they need more games. I don't really hear about internationals for Spain outside of the World Cup. There needs to be more game time for them, and needs to be more game time as a whole for all of the nations involved. Scotland and Ireland, they need to develop. They've got teams like there is a team in Scotland that basically play all wheelchair sports effectively, and that's where a lot of the Scottish players came from. That team, I think it's Dundee. That have the team, but don't quote me on that one. There needs to be more opportunity there. And I think within the wheelchair game, it's probably a bit more feasible to say, for example, have that Scottish side in the Wheelchair Super League. in the UK. The same with having a Welsh team there, or an Irish team maybe, if they can fund the travel, of course. Because as far as the domestic competitions, things, I don't think you can probably have enough quality teams at the moment within, say, just Ireland or Scotland to be able to maintain standards and improve standards. Bringing them into the Wheelchair Super League certainly would. They'd be playing against these high quality players week in, week out, and it would only help to drive standards up to create more competitive nations. We look at a success story of the tournament being the USA wheelchair team. Managed to get a win at the World Cup, and it's seen the emergence of players like Mackenzie Johnson. They have some talented individuals, and they are tapping into the Invictus Games athletes to really try and bolster participation in the sport. And the wheelchair side's involvement in the World Cup and their performance is also increasing interest in the able-bodied game over there as well. We're getting a lot of word out of the US finally on their domestic competition improving. There was supposed to be a semi-pro competition starting this year. There's been an upheaval on the political situation within the rugby league governing body over there, so we're still waiting to hear about things like that. But there is progress on the forward front, and in the wheelchair side, there's definite progress. There are more teams emerging off the back of this World Cup, and obviously with the Invictus Games athletes, there's going to be even more to come. Who's to say USA might not be a force in the wheelchair game over the next few years? And hopefully we can have more nations involved in the next wheelchair tournament. Norway were meant to take part this year. They obviously had to withdraw. So there are nations out there playing the game. And hopefully these sides can get internationals to develop their own players and improve standards ahead of the next tournament. Hopefully we get less big blowout scores and more competitive games. Even though there's only 3 years till the next World Cup, I think there's enough time to do enough work with these sides to really improve the standards, because it's not full-time professional versus amateur. It's mostly like at semi-pro at best to amateur. And if with more game time, more training time, this gap can definitely close. A similar thing could be said about the women's game as well. But like I said, closing the gap between, say, England and Canada or England and Brazil can probably be done over the next 5-10 years with the right investment and just having a bit more time on the training field. Brazil showed they have potential. Canada showed they have potential to be decent sides. The Cook Islands have big, powerful players. Maybe more access in the NRLW for some of those women going forward. Hopefully, we can see more of the Pacific sides. We've had Tonga and Samoa in there before. Who's to say we can't generate more interest in there off the back of this tournament and the success of this tournament? France struggled, but the signs are there. They have some skillful players, and their season only really got back underway after COVID very late, like early this year. So their development took a step back, and it's only off the back of like the year they've spent together in the training camp and some of the players coming over to play in the Women's Super League here. Likes of Beville at Wigan. There was a couple at York as well. Song Poosh, I believe, was one of them. So some of these players, they're getting more access at higher level. You've got the Catalan Dragons women's team as well. Potentially involved. Obviously, they were in the Women's Challenge Cup. And that's positive signs, but it needs to take the next level. It needs to take the next step over there. Obviously, more regular game time with England will help. The likes of Wales and Ireland now having women's national sides, able to play internationals. Hopefully, they can be involved within World Cup qualifiers and just further internationals. Because more international game time for these sides is only going to help drive them up. It's only going to help improve them. And hopefully, we can maybe have more women's teams in the next World Cup as well. Hopefully, there's more qualifiers. There needs to be more active game time for some of these newer sides as well. And there are rumblings already of a tri-nation series between Brazil, Canada, and France aiming for next year, which would be fantastic because all three are at a very similar level. I'd say France are the best of the three teams, but they're not a million miles apart. So a competition like that would be excellent for the women's game. Obviously, Australia are leagues above everyone right now. And we then have the question of how do you close that gap? Positives on the women's side, I'd say the crowds as a whole for a lot of the women's games were good. It's generated huge interest in the women's game, new teams cropping up, more girls wanting to get involved in the sport. They're seeing like new heroes, new role models for the first time. The access on free-to-air TV with the women's game and so many people watching the games now, it was fantastic to see. And we need more of that in the future. And hopefully capitalize on this new interest with the next step for the women's game here. And that has to start with being paid. The England women's team were paid for the first time for this World Cup. Leeds have already confirmed they'll be paying their players from next season on a semi-professional basis. The same has to happen across the board. Likes of York, likes of St Helens, likes of Wigan, Warrington, Huddersfield. All of these teams. It can't be amateur. They need the time on the training field. They need more time on the training field to work on more core skills, fitness, and strength if they are to have any hope of closing the gap that is widening by the month between UK and Australia in the women's game. Just because of the difference in professionalism. But the core skills of the England players improved leagues and bounds during the World Cup itself because they were able to get access to that full-time environment in their camp. That level of professionalism needs to stay in the women's game to drive up standards even further. We have more teams coming up. The women, young girls have these like role models to look up to now. Women's sport as a whole is growing by the day in this country and worldwide. Look at the ability of the England women's football team this year. The England women's rugby union team coming within a hair's breadth of winning the rugby union women's World Cup final. The England women's performing better than expected in the Rugby League World Cup and certainly pushing New Zealand all the way. Something which, based off the last World Cup, you wouldn't have expected. So there's a lot to be positive for in the women's game there. Crowds could still use some work. We need some more investment, more push to get people through the doors to respect the women's game a bit better. As too many people, I heard the comments myself while out and about. I saw them online. So it's like, who cares about the women's game? Well, have you ever watched a game? Because while the skill might not be perfect, especially if you look at the Australia Gillaroos, it's a damn sight better than some of the men's teams. And that's showing what the women's game could be. And imagine if the right investment and the right attitudes were shown towards that game, it could only go from strength to strength. And hopefully, by the time the next World Cup comes along, the game has been able to progress like that, both here and in the other countries. To the fact where people are genuinely, even actually invested, to the point where England may have a chance. There's more people wanting to go to the games. You were getting bigger crowds at the women's matches, to the point where it's financially viable to not only pay these players, but pay them at a good rate so that they can really develop their skills and go even further. Imagine how good the England women's team could have been if they were professional going into this, like the entire season. Like even one full season of professional rugby league might have made even more difference. It certainly might have closed the fitness gap because skills-wise, they weren't bad. They weren't far off the Ferns. I'd say difference in the end was the physicality. Perhaps that would certainly for the semi-final for England's point of view. Skills-wise, that just needs time on the training field to work more on them to iron out the deficiencies in certain skill sets. The same can be said for any side, male, female, wheelchair, all of it. So that's something that needs to happen off the back of it. But there is a lot more interest and there's a lot more eyes on the women's game now and on the wheelchair game. So we need to, we need to capitalize on the back of these interests. We need to push the envelope, and these two versions of the game can be what spearheads rugby league into being a truly global sport. More nations in the Americas opening up and playing rugby league. More nations over in Asia, in Africa. We're seeing the starts of women's tournaments in Africa recently. So that can only be good for the game. More nations playing. We have a lot of nations playing the sport at some level. And that's, we'll go into those kind of things as well later when we get to the men's tournament. But more teams playing it, more access to the World Cup, more qualifiers. Hopefully then expand out the World Cup to more teams able to take part, which means more games, more eyes on the sport, more opportunities, and help really develop it into a global force. Now to the men's World Cup. And yeah, Australia, too good in the end. I generally think England would have pushed it a bit closer in the final than what Samoa did, providing they showed up. They didn't show up in the semi-final, so they didn't deserve to be there. There was and said like it was a one bad off day. Yes, it took extra time to be beaten, but I'd have felt bad if we actually managed to win that because we didn't deserve to on the performance on the day. There was that familiar sense of hope, though, throughout the World Cup. Huge viewing figures on the TV side of things because of the BBC coverage, which for rugby, for the first time in a long time, was excellent. Like, cannot fault the BBC for their coverage of the World Cup on that side of things. The crowds, however, on the whole, were disappointing. In terms of crowds within the grounds. Yeah, they may have brought in a little more money because of higher prices, but the crowds on the whole were smaller. They were around about 20,000 aggregate less than the 2013 World Cup held on the soil, on the British soil, despite having 2 more games. So we got to think, why is that? Now, a lot of people complaining on the ticket price side of things. I've mentioned this before. The early bird prices were good. I got all my tickets basically for 15 quid each, except for the final, which I paid more. Now, people ignored the early bird sale. A lot of people did, because it's like, oh, we'll get it closer to the time. And they were warned that the prices would go up after the early bird, which they did inevitably, but I think they were priced a bit too high. I think off the fact that the World Cup had to be postponed because of the pandemic and we've got the cost of living crisis, I think the decisions to maintain the high ticket prices was probably the wrong one. You wanted to maximize the numbers in the ground. You wanted to maximize the numbers watching the game. Keep as many eyes as possible on the games. And some of the crowds were genuinely disappointing. They were. There were some fantastic crowds. So not all of them were bad. We had more people watching the game in Coventry between Australia and Scotland than in some of the Heartland areas. So why is this? There was an oversaturation and over-reliance on certain grounds and certain areas for matches. If anything, a town should have had maybe 1 or 2 maximum. But some venues were used 4 times. With these same high prices, it's not going to draw in the kind of crowds that you want for some of those games. But then we look at impressive crowds. Newcastle, over 40,000 for the England game there. We look at like Coventry had over 10,000. That's in a huge stadium. Yeah, okay, maybe not as impressive, but it's still more than some of the Heartland areas, showing that there is an appetite for sport there. There is an appetite for rugby league there. We have the Midlands Hurricanes there. Maybe invest in them and make a genuine force so that next time if Coventry are hosting an international, there could be 20,000 there or more. We look at Ireland versus New Zealand. It was a great crowd for that game. People really turned out for that one, which was fantastic to see. We look at the crowd for the semi-final in the Emirates. Over 40,000. Fantastic. It wasn't a sellout, which was disappointing, but it was still a good crowd. But and obviously the World Cup final for 2 neutral teams having 67,000. More than the Football World Cup opener, I might add. Like, the big thing for this, like, not all the crowds were bad, but some of them weren't good enough. And it's not to blame fans on this side of things. It's look at why was this the case? And I think the pricing strategy was wrong as a whole. And not recognizing the change in living circumstances after the postponement of the initial World Cup, and when they noticed that sales weren't doing good and they were just basically being stubbornly held at these high prices as profit at all cost, profit at all cost. You need to take a longer look at it and look at the bigger picture. We need people watching the game. We need people in the grounds to watch these games. If they're not buying the tickets like en masse, why is this happening? Why is this the case? And I'm sorry, but 70 quid to sit behind the sticks at Leeds when a standing ticket is 10 to 15 pounds at the side, which is probably a better view of the game as a whole. Pricing strategies, wrong on that one. That's my personal opinion on it. I bought tickets. I was able to buy tickets for as many games as I could. So I also do have some annoyance at fans who just sat back and said, no, I'm not going to buy tickets. I'm not going to go. When's the next time the World Cup's going to be on English soil? Probably not for a long time. Like, this was the opportunity. This was the chance to go see these players in person. And yeah, okay, there was the access to BBC on free-to-air. But, I mean, it's International Rugby League. We need to show that there's the appetite there for it. I think the viewing figures helped on that front, but again, some of the crowds a little disappointing. Now let's look at the scores. The blowouts. Yes, there were blowout scores. Am I concerned by it? In the likes of Jamaica and Greece? No. Scotland? Absolutely. Because Scotland have been around longer. They've been playing the game at a higher level for longer. This should not happen for Scotland. And you have to look at why it happened to Scotland. They don't have the quality of players that they used to call on. They drew with New Zealand as short a time ago as 2016. So what has happened since then and now that has sent them so far backwards that they were humiliated by Australia? And it's the fact that the player generation is not there for some of these nations. We look at Wales. Why were they fielding only semi-professional players and not able to get like the full-time athletes that they need to compete? Bear in mind, Wales gave a massive effort. Like they were huge in effort, and it was the kind of effort that Scotland should have brought for their games. But the heart wasn't shown by the Scots until their final game against Fiji. Why did it take 2 full games for that heart to be shown? Wales gave it in every single one of their games. Ireland played fantastic in 2 of their 3 games. The Lebanon one as an exception. And we look at, so what needs to be done in the other home nations to get them on par, because it's what is needed to be done. Greece and Jamaica, first time appearances at the World Cup. Never before qualified. And they had to go through so many hoops to get there. Jamaica had to win the Americas qualifiers, which I'm talking about these qualifiers as a whole because so many Australians are so ignorant that says, well, why are we allowing countries in to this World Cup who don't even play the sport? 1, there is domestic competition in all of the nations who play in this World Cup. 2, they had to qualify. Greece had to win 2 separate qualifying tournaments to even get even close to be considered. I think they actually had to win 3. They overcame Serbia in the final qualifying after winning Euro D, then Euro C, and then finally got into the final round robin where they overcame Serbia in their final game to qualify. Denying teams like this a right to qualify for a World Cup, as has been some calls on Australians saying that, why do we allow teams in? Why don't we just have like the top 10 nations in the world? Just a bit of a league or something like that. And become even more insular and narrow and exclusive than it currently is. There are over 90 countries that play rugby league worldwide. 90. That's 90. Not 19, 90. And the argument you should be saying is that, we shouldn't let the countries in that don't play the game. Like, they don't even have leagues. No, what you mean to say is they don't have leagues on the level of the NRL and the Super League. Which is obvious. they don't play at that same level because the game is still newer in those countries. We've had over 100 years, 120 years in some cases, of the game on our homes, on our shores. Of course, it's going to be at a higher level than countries that were started in the early 2000s. Jamaica, 2003. Greece, 2003. Jamaica, 2005. What do you expect? But the investment and development is happening. They have domestic competitions. How do we get them to that next level? Jamaica now offering scholarships for people to go to university to play rugby league. Greece, the game only was legalized a few months before the World Cup, but they have a domestic competition. Their new season is starting. And we look at the legacy this World Cup is leaving. Greece, they're getting more teams. More teams are starting up. More people are coming to the coaching seminars to set up new squads so that the game can grow further. Now, there is a really useful thing within Greece that this game could go professional quickly if given the right investment, which is where Greek clubs adopt a rugby league club. Now, I learned this from a Greek friend of mine. Basically, you have teams like Panathinaikos. You have the football team, but they also have the basketball team and other sports. Imagine if they could put some investment and say, I don't know, a Panathinaikos rugby league team. Not only does it then become no longer purely amateur, you have the investment there, which means more time for them to train, develop core skills, and all of a sudden they can grow in standard. It's not going to happen overnight, and the golfing class is going to take years to close between nations like that. The USA are getting more teams involved. You're going to see a much more competitive USA in their World Cup qualifiers. We have more access to World Cup qualifiers around the world. In fact, fun story. The World Cup qualifiers for 2025 have already begun with the South American qualifiers that began this weekend. There's a South America's Championship started this weekend, which is the start of movement towards the next World Cup. You didn't know that one, did you? But then let's look at the World Cup itself, the one that just took place, the other nations involved. We have talk in Australia saying there are too many European sides involved. And if we look at the teams, of the 16 involved in the World Cup, 7 of them came from Europe, almost 50%. True. It's a good point. There are 7 sides from the South Pacific as well, from that small part of the world. We want more representation of a World Cup for a World Cup. So take more spots from Europe and give them to them. Okay. But then that still leaves an overwhelming skew of the South Pacific as well. I agree that more areas of the world need to be represented. There's also, we need an Africa qualifier. Yes. But the current system of qualifying is denying that right now because Africa is covered by the MEA, which is Middle East and Africa. That spot is guaranteed because of Lebanon's performance in the World Cup. They made the quarterfinals, and as it stands, all 8 quarterfinalists automatically qualify. Lebanon have the MEA spot, which is the only one currently given to that area, and they've already automatically qualified. So how do we open that up? Do we add an extra spot for Africa's? We also want a spot on the Far East. We also want spots, maybe additional ones in the Americas. And that does need to happen. We need it to be a more global game. 16 at the moment is a good number for the World Cup, for the men's. I think long term we want to push towards 20. Similar to the Rugby Union World Cup, where they have 4 pools of 5. I think that has to be an aim. And obviously we have the World Cup qualifiers, but we have that anyway. There are over 30 nations playing rugby league in Europe. So obviously there needs to be a number of spots there. And you say, there needs to be qualifiers. There are. Anyone who doesn't make the quarterfinals has to qualify for the next World Cup. Wales, Scotland, and Ireland all have to go through the qualifiers because they didn't get out of the group stage this time. So too will Greece. And they will begin their journey again next year with the Euro Championships, with their first official home international, first legal home international. They'll be playing against the Ukraine early next year. Personally, one way to resolve world participation-wise within the 16 teams is to reduce the number of slots, yes, to Europe and the South Pacific. If we take even just one spot away, that means 6 from Europe, 6 in the South Pacific. That leaves 4 spots available elsewhere. And for now, based on the standard in other areas, let's add Americas and Africa, or Africa and Asia kind of thing. But have qualifiers involving like everyone, so that like with the South Americas one, I'm not sure how it's going to work with them right now. I know there's the South America's Championship. You've got Brazil playing Colombia, Argentina are involved, Chile are involved. They were involved in the qualifying for the last World Cup. Whether the winner of this will then join the Americas qualifying group with Jamaica, USA, and Canada remains to be seen. We'll say we get a North America's qualifier and a South America's qualifier. Give that 2 teams. As far as Asia and Africa goes, I think those 2 need to be combined right now. So the winner of an Asia's qualify and the winner of an Africa's qualify to play each other. Simply because the standard is not at the level of the other nations who are currently in the World Cups. Greece would probably comfortably defeat anyone from Africa or the Far East Asia. Same with the South Americas right now, with Jamaica comfortably beating them. And then they were hammered in a lot of their games in the World Cup. So we need to keep... I mean, you talk about not wanting blowout scores. You talk about not wanting like huge like embarrassments to certain nations. But we look at what it meant to the players involved. Once in a lifetime opportunity. Look at the reaction from Jamaica when they scored their try against New Zealand. That's what international sport is about. That 1 in a million chance, that once in a lifetime opportunity to play the biggest teams in the world and to score against, like, that is like a lifetime achievement for some of them. Like Greece scoring against England, they scored in every single game they played. And we say again, complaining about blowouts. Let's look at rugby union. Now, the reason I keep bringing it towards is there has to be a similar path where similar sports, and in terms of qualifying, 1995, I believe it was, and one of the Rugby Union World Cups around that time, Japan played New Zealand and were beaten by over 130 points. Fast forward to this year, and they held them virtually to a draw. Development takes time. It takes money. It takes genuine, concerted effort into growing the sports in these games. And given the same time, given the same investment, given the same opportunities, the same can happen for the likes of Greece, the likes of Jamaica, the US, the South Americas, the Far East in rugby league. Because, I mean, Japan play the sport. Philippines play the sport. And I said, over 90 countries play rugby league at some level. Not necessarily professional level, but at some level. The game is certainly growing. We have the Africa's Championship. I would wager that Nigeria and Ghana are the 2 strongest African nations right now in rugby league. They deserve a chance to qualify for the World Cup. I fully agree with that. All nations who play the sport should have that opportunity, and trying to be insular and close-minded and take these opportunities away, how's that going to encourage participation in the sport? How's that going to encourage growth in the sport? It's not. So, because I'm not also just having a go at Australian sports, because there's a lot of fans in the UK of a similar mindset. Why are these teams in blowout scores? Every single sport in the World Cup have these kind of sport results. And here is a point, though, back to Australian fans. If we adopted your policy that you want of just only the top nations allowed and like don't have these other nations involved, have them in their own like separate tournament because they're not good enough. Okay, let's adopt that in every sport policy, shall we? In that case, Australia will never compete in a football World Cup ever again because they're not good enough. Is that what you want? Do you want to take the opportunity away from the Socceroos to ever compete against the likes of Brazil? The opportunity to play against the likes of Germany, against England at that top level in a World Cup? Of course you wouldn't. How about in rugby union? The game is growing. We look at the likes of Portugal, who just got through probably their fourth qualifying tournament in the last gasp saloon to qualify for their second ever Rugby Union World Cup. Are we going to take the opportunity for them to play against the likes of the All Blacks, against the likes of Ireland, and France, and England, away from them just because they can't play at the same they're not necessarily at the same level? Of course not. These teams need the chance and the dream to be able to play against the top sides. Access to more internationals, access to more develop will grow the game. Access to more internationals will grow more interest in the game and help develop grassroots rugby league in all of these countries. It is not going to happen overnight. We are not going to all of a sudden get 20, 30 highly competitive countries overnight. It may take decades. It will certainly take a lot of money and a lot of investment, but the quality of the product is there if we stick with it. How do we improve internationals? And then we look at performance of the World Cup as well. Northern Hemisphere versus Southern Hemisphere, which is one of the reasons why a lot of Australian fans are calling for this reduced World Cup. Of the European sides, only one made it out of the group stage. England. Yes, Lebanon are a Northern Hemisphere side, but a lot of their players largely based in Australia. So we're going to say it as it is. One European side made it out of the group. France were the next best, and they came third after a heavy defeat to Samoa. So, and with England's failure in the semi-finals, there are people saying that England are behind Samoa and Tonga. That's bullshit. I'm saying that right now. That is absolute bullshit. One off day. It took England's worst off day in years and extra time to lose that semi-final. They are not behind Samoa. They are not behind Tonga. It is still the top three. It is Australia, New Zealand, England. But we do have 5 to 6 genuinely top-tier teams now. I'd still include Fiji in that. They came within a hair's breadth of beating New Zealand in their quarterfinal. They've done that before, 2017. Tonga are growing from strength to strength. Samoa are growing from strength to strength, and were absolutely phenomenal as World Cup. I'm not taking anything away from their achievement. To say they're ahead of England as a whole is arrogance. It is ignorance. Because we look at day one in the World Cup, they had 60 points put on them by England. Was that an off day for Samoa? Yes. Was a semi-final an off day for England? Yes. Both can be true. But as a whole, I'd say if that semi-final got replayed, England would win. The next time England plays Samoa, probably. If England showed up, if both teams showed up, England would come out on top in that case. The problem now is the growth and emergence of the South Pacific sides like Tonga and Samoa needs to be capitalized on. They need more international. At current, they don't have another scheduled international for a while. Why? NRL got rid of the Pacific mid-season tests. That needs to change. We need those test series back. We need to capitalize on the interest in the countries involved. How about Samoa versus Tonga in Samoa and Tonga? Have them play their test there. Have Fiji play against Papua New Guinea in consistent tests. Have the Cook Islands involved in these test internationals as well. Help develop their game. Have more players involved coming over, playing in the Australian competitions. Not necessarily the NRL if they're not good enough, but the semi-professional competition, the Queensland Cup, the New South Wales Cup, and the level below that are still high standards, which will develop the players massively. And that needs to be taken into account in the South Pacific as the game is growing and growing and growing with these nations, and they're emerging as main powers. And in a few years, could overtake England if something doesn't change. England's biggest problem right now is the lack of genuine competition, internationally speaking. The best competition is France. And England are comfortably better than France right now. The game is growing in France. It's getting better and better. And they're hoping to be full-time, have their domestic competition as full-time professional by the time the 2025 World Cup happens. That would be a legacy off the back of recent improvements, which is only good for the sport because it will give England more competition. Ireland are probably the next best. If they can maintain their current crop of players and develop them further, we could have a genuine competition for England there. But Ireland don't have their next game scheduled. We need tests between England and Ireland. We need a European nations kind of format and for England to commit with their first team. It was rumored to be thrown around with like England's first team going down under to play in the South Pacific and have the Knights play against the likes of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. But the Celtic nations said no because it would devalue the competition. Which, I mean, obviously, England Knights, they need game time. They need to develop for future England players. But the likes of Wales, Scotland, Ireland, they need more internationals against the top sides, which England are the top side right now. How would a European nations, like a Six Nations kind of thing, work? Have Italy involved. Their domestic competition is getting stronger and stronger, and there's work being done there. Have their domestic-based players play in a European nations format with the likes of Wales, Ireland, Scotland. Have France involved. We can have Greece involved, help develop the sport there. We could see Lebanon maybe even involved with giving them Northern Hemisphere action where they are based. There needs to be more opportunity for things like that. But how do we do that with such a crammed domestic season? Reduce the number of fixtures. At current, in the likes of Super League, there are 27 regular rounds plus playoffs and the Challenge Cup. You play every team home and away once, plus Magic Weekend, plus loop fixtures. If we take out the Magic Weekend, as good as it is, as fun as it's been, I think it's lost sight of what it was when it began. And we take out all the loop fixtures. That is an extra 5 weekends. One, players get a bit more of a break who aren't necessarily involved in internationals. And two, it opens up an extra 5 weeks for an international window. Maybe some mid-season internationals. Maybe like a Six Nations format is done during the season in rugby union. We could have something similar in league within the Northern Hemisphere. Yes, England are likely going to win for quite a few years. But there needs to be that move. There needs to be that start. There needs to be, because, again, access to more internationals gives these nations more incentive to develop players. There is a hotbed of potential talent, especially in the likes of Ireland. So many players don't quite make the grade at rugby union in Ireland. But with the right coaching and the right access to another option, could become great rugby league players. If the game can develop there. We have a number of domestic teams over there. Why not bring a franchise over to, I don't know, Championship 1, like we have the Welsh sides? Let's have one in Scotland as well. Because having access and having visibility of teams playing at higher levels will grow interest in the sport. Off the back of that, develop the domestic games further, have more teams, have more. And with these people, because the same on the rugby union side can be said with Scotland and Wales. There's a hotbed of rugby talent in both of those countries. And rugby league and union can be similar games. So why isn't league bigger in these countries? That has to be failures of down how rugby league has been run. Certainly in the UK. And things that need to change. We need more internationals. The appetite is there. The viewership figures on the BBC and attendance figures for the large part show this. And that is what we need to take away from the World Cups as a whole. More international game time, more investment. We're seeing legacy funding trickle down and already being spent in community clubs as we speak. Greece, gaining ground on their domestic competitions. It's legal in Greece to play rugby league. They're going to get so much more funding off the back of it, which is fantastic to see. And hopefully they will be there or thereabouts when it comes to qualifying again. Jamaica, they're growing. USA, after seeing the performance of their wheelchair team, are growing and building their domestic side. So too are Canada. We are seeing more nations competing. We are seeing more. We need more access to the World Cup qualifiers, and we need to grow the game beyond the two small areas. We have Europe and South Pacific, which is what makes up the bulk of the nations involved. Hopefully, one day we can have a truly global World Cup. But that's going to take time, investment, and money. And those are my final thoughts on the Rugby League World Cup as a whole. Thank you all so much for watching. I've been your host, Super Saiyan Blue Lucario. Let me know your thoughts about the World Cup. Let me know your thoughts about what Rugby League should do next as a global scale. What were your highlights of the World Cup? And yeah, just let me know down in the comment section down below. Make sure to smash that like button and subscribe for more content every week. Until next time, it's time for me to have a cup of tea.